Thanks. I'm Adam Guren. I'm an economist. I hope you're ready for some equations. So rather than talking about my academic research, I'm going to talk to you about some pro bono policy work I did for Mayor Wu in the last few months about what has stalled construction of rental housing in Boston and what can we do to jumpstart it. So there's currently a historically large backlog of market rate multifamily rental housing that the BPDA has approved, but that hasn't started construction. So about 8,000 units as of last summer. And Mayor Wu asked Ed Glazer, her former professor, to form a committee of experts to study the possibility for property tax abatement, so reducing property taxes for developers to jumpstart construction. And you can see who is on the committee up here. I want to acknowledge them. I also want to say I'm not speaking for them, any of their institutions, and especially not the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. We did not make any policy recommendations in our report, which can be found on the Boston Fed website, but we described the costs and trade-offs to the mayor of different policies, and based on our report, the mayor switched from saying that she was going to do this to saying this was not something she was planning on doing at the time. So we wanted, when we were doing this analysis, to really have a decision for how developers decide whether to build a building that resonated with them. So we talked to a lot of people who teach development, and it all comes down to this basic equation here, which is basically that the net operating income, which is the amount of income you make in a given year from operating the building, divided by the construction costs. You can think of that ratio as the return on the asset for the developer has to be greater than or equal to some hurdle rate. So what's in the net operating income? It's rent minus operating costs minus taxes. That's our policy variable. And in construction costs, there's land costs, hard costs, the cost of building the building, soft costs, everything from architecture to insurance, and then financing costs, the cost of getting a loan while you build. And that has to be greater than or equal to some hurdle rate, and that hurdle rate is affected by interest rates on other assets, in particular interest rates that are set by the Federal Reserve, as well as risk and expectations of house prices. Now, the 2,000-pound gorillas in this equation are hard costs, which are about 80% of total costs for most buildings, and that hurdle rate. And that hurdle rate has been going up by about 1% to 2% because of the increase in interest rates that the Fed has done to fight inflation. And hard costs are up about 50% in Boston. So if you look at this figure here, I'm supposed to stay here. In blue, you can see the return. That's this ratio here, and it's going down. In red, you can see the hurdle rate, which has been going up. I think it's actually gone up more than this figure shows, but this is the data we had. And what you can see down here is the numerator in green and the denominator in red. So basically, the numerator has been flat. Rents have been going up, but so have these other things. But construction costs have gone up by about 50% in the last 3 years. And this has meant that very few buildings that were drawn up pre-pandemic made sense to build today. On the right, we show you what would have happened if construction costs hadn't fallen. In that case, more buildings would have made sense to build. So then what we did is we calculated NOI over construction costs for every building that has been approved but not yet built. This took a lot of work. And then we altered tax policy under several hurdle rate scenarios, and we had 4 main takeaways. The first is you can't build that many buildings with this tax abatement policy. Why? Because taxes are 1% of the assessed value, and assessed value is basically costs. So you can increase that NOI over cost ratio by 1 percentage point, but construction costs have gone up so much and interest rates have gone up so much that very few units are within 1 percentage point of being penciling. Second, the cost of this policy is actually quite expensive, over $167,000 in foregone taxes per unit built. Why is that? Because the city doesn't know which buildings are going to be built in the absence of the policy and which ones aren't. And they have to give the subsidy to builders who would have built anyway, in addition to the builders who are building because they got the subsidy. Third, the most cost-effective policies involve a cap on the per-unit subsidy. It turns out that the people who are going to get the bigger subsidy are the luxury buildings that assess at the highest assessed value. So we said that if you cap that, you actually shrink the cost of the policy much more than you shrink units built. And that leads to the most cost-effective policies, which are still in the $200,000 per unit range. And finally, the most significant headwind, I hope I've convinced you, is construction costs. And tax subsidies can't make up that huge gap, but we need to do something to bring down construction costs, because right now, you invert the equation I showed you, Rents have to be really, really high to cover construction costs right now. And if we can't solve construction costs, we're not going to build and rents are going to be really high. So thank you very much.